Professors and university employees of Reddit, what behind the scenes campus drama went on that students never knew about? In our chemistry department a few years back, a grad student who was failing started poisoning another graduate student they worked with closely by putting carcinogens in their foods and drinks. Colorless, odorless, flavorless. Thanks to his chemistry knowledge, he was eventually caught, and I'm not sure what happened to him. Thrown out for sure. Perhaps arrested. Another year a grad student pushed another student down a flight of steps to try to kill them. Chemists are crazy. 2 professors arrested for meth production. One for murdering his wife with lab supplies. Another stepped down quietly for embezzlement. And that's how we replaced half our chemistry department in a year. One of our male English professors was being stalked by a female student, to the point he had to get a restraining order against her. The only reason my class knew was because she saw him in the hallway, entered our classroom and made a huge scene the first day of class. And security had to be called to make her leave. After that, the door was always locked for that class, and whoever was in the back row were scouters to let in late students. He also had to cancel class to go to court for the situation at least once. Our heads of department or course directors would purposely keep dragging students, the act of pulling a student through their studies, even though they'd fail most classes. They'd purposely grade the student just above a pass even though the content of work was astonishingly bad, because if they left or dropped out it'd look bad on the course's stats and dropout rate. Not to mention the university not getting the student loan money. From there, of course, statistics would be ridiculously high for that particular degree, so they'd then sell this to prospective students and parents. This is currently still going on. Source: I'm a lecturer at a university and yes, it disgusts me. Edit: I'm a UK-based lecturer, not from the US. My professor for grad school had his lab raided by the FBI. This happened long before I joined. Apparently, one of his first or second class of grad students in the 80s-90s decided that they wanted to use lab resources to brew some meth. Very easy to do with the equipment we have. From what I am told, this student would stay late in lab after others had left to get this done. In Breaking Bad style, he fences his Drew Gus to some distributor and thought that was the end of it. The purity of his Drew Gus was enough that they were able to trace it back from the streets to him and the lab. A sting operation shut down the lab while the dust settled, and my professor was cleared of all wrongdoing, since none of this was under his direct control, and all campus resources were being misused by the student. State Intelligence Bureau told the professor that it was the largest and purest operation they had seen in the state at this time. Grades came out. At that time they were printed. The burst of the device that cut the grade cards up into a mailable format has a torn belt. We could not in any way get a replacement belt from the manufacturer, so we measured how long the belt needed to be. Then we went to an auto parts store and looked at a lot of belts before we settled on one and bought it. It fit the burster and we had all the grade cards mailed that night. Prominent professor was sleeping with his students. Actually, he met his wife that way, and then had a huge issue with dating other students after getting married. Lawsuits were threatened. He resigned and moved 3,000, edit this was exaggerated by about 2,000, miles away very quickly. No news. No public info released, it was all just known through the grapevine of staff. Edit, it was in the Midwest. But it seems this happens at every school based on comments. No. I'm not going to say where. I think students would be surprised just how much drama happens. I am talking everything from major drama like lawsuits that universities have kept quiet, or complaints to colleagues itching at each other because one thought the other one rolled her eyes at the other one. I just went to a faculty meeting that was so tense and angry that I legitimately wanted to leave the room, and it was over a small wording difference of opinion and a policy that literally does not matter because it is departmental and not university wide, so it's going to get struck down anyway. Anyway, sometimes I am happy to go to class or meet with students in my office because that is the fun part of the job, and usually drama free until the last week of classes when everyone starts hustling for a higher grade. Night shift janitor made some really good moonshine. Some of the professors and grad students would leave cash in our top desk drawers when we left work. And the next day, a mason jar of handmade shine would be waiting there. He's since moved on from that department. But was good people. It would have been really weird if someone didn't know about that system. Left some cash in their desk. Showed up the next day. Find out they've been robbed. But the moonshine fairy had left them a gift. I used to be a custodian at a prominent university, and one of the TAs in the art department would routinely leave her studio a pigsty and then assured her students not to sweat the mess. We're just giving the janitor something to do. A number of students complained about her sense of entitlement, and she was rejected for a professorship for calling me a janitor instead of the proper nomenclature, custodian. I worked at a large university, and right before I started, the longtime dean of the school went on sabbatical. I didn't think anything of it until 2 months later when I found out that the university forced him to take time off because he blew almost all of the school's budget on fancy dinners with donors. We're talking like $1,000 plus on alcohol heavy meals. Showed up to official university events high off coke. And kept a second admin assistant as essentially his sixth slave. He had a private bathroom with a shower installed in his office. He sent the school into a major budget crisis and was a PR disaster waiting to happen. It was a huge mess. The acting dean who stepped in got a lot of shit for how much damage control she had to do. Ultimately he returned a few years later just as a part-time faculty member. But still. Totally wild. I was a grad student in a major university. The department pretty much all loathed one another. And the professors had multiple alliances that were probably more complex than any game of civil play. At one point in time, a group of professors had aligned to overthrow the dean. And they were so successful in doing so that the dean wasn't fired, they were demoted to department secretary. It was brutal. I had a colleague who had people on their doc committee get into an argument and refuse to sign off on anything they did. Not because of the quality of the work, but because the professors hated each other. I work for a prominent university in Japan. My Japanese colleagues tend to follow all rules very strictly and blindly follow manuals. One day an American professor had to rush to the US to see his dying mother. The staff members of class operations called him as he was grieving, asking him to still teach classes and review reports. Obviously, the lack of empathy and inflexibility led the professor to take his bags and work for another school. Students never knew the true reason why he stopped teaching. I work at a college in the Midwest. A few years ago, our president very quickly resigned. Turns out his son was growing weed in their basement and was selling out of their house. Whether the president knew or not is still being debated, but he still resigned. Apparently there were quite a few rich kids who didn't study, go to class, contribute, or maintain a GPA above a 3.0 whose parents shockingly paid for them to get into those schools. Professors were purchasing tricked out laptops with their budgets shortly before leaving the university. The university in turn would let the professors purchase the hardware for a song because it was used. We're talking 3000 euro machines being purchased 6 months down the line for 500 euros. Someone finally caught on to this scheme and now nobody can purchase the used hardware. Academia sometimes draws ridiculous people. I had a dean once who caused so much turmoil so often by simply denying objective reality when it didn't suit her. I remember spearheading a project to repurpose a section of our building. I got the plans and she refused to believe the blueprints on square footage. So I measured it myself. She pretended it wasn't the case. It wasn't large enough to accommodate its new purpose. But according to her it was because in her mind it was 30% larger. I went over her head and ended up in meetings with higher administration trying to get them to understand. They all took her side. She proceeded to make my life hell for the remainder of my time at the university. My teacher was Syrian. He was practically always at university. Always tired. Always acting off. Would sleep in his office. Would forget to hand back assignments. Would mix up basic things. cry randomly in the hallway. We later found out his family was being held hostage back home while he was teaching in Canada. I had an advanced calculus teacher who'd come into class stoned out of his mind. He'd write down equations on the board from a book. And about 15-20 minutes in, he'd invariably excuse himself and take a bathroom break. He'd then return, coked out of his mind, and proceed to solve all equations in less than 5 minutes and non-stop monologued about the topic for another 5. Then dismissed the class and stormed out. Invariably, if you actually understood or not. Most students seemed physically stunned and dazed by the whole process. I don't know whether he was a freaking genius or a deranged drug fiend. But I studied in a big university at the time. And recently I heard he was made head teacher of the math department. So I don't know what to think. It's often speculated or rumored that university professors are sometimes attracted to their students. But it can work the other way. As was the case with me when I was teaching music history. One female student sat as close as she could get, followed me around, and was always doing extra things to win favor, to the point where it became obvious to her peers. Rather than embarrass this student by discussing it with her directly, or fellow staff members and the dean, I patiently wound her down gradually over time until she eventually got the idea nothing would come of it. P.S. Enjoy your cake day. Design responsibly. Was on a grand jury. One of the deans of a community college was finance officer for some kind of club campus organization that was mothballed, but for some reason they never closed out the bank account associated with the organization. She eventually became the preparer and approver for that account and quickly went about paying her condo fees with money that was still being directed to the account. I don't recall why it was still being replenished. She also gave one of her relatives a no-show job tutoring students paid out of the account, and they ended up splitting the salary. We sent that one off to trial. She was ducked. I'm a student at my community college. But before I went I was friends with a recently divorced dad that was a professor there. He did so IDK if that's a professor or what. The divorce was ugly. Like really ugly. Even helped him clean up his house after she trashed it, taking everything out of it. Fast forward 2 years and I see her at the school in M's gear. Well, turns out she also is a professor at the school. That she'd had to be hard as duck to work with your ex that wrecked your house. I was a graduate teaching assistant for the woman professor who taught the marketing class. Even though I was in a committed relationship, she would regularly come on to me when I was at school. One evening she called me in a panic telling me that she was feeling suicidal and really needed someone to be with her so that she didn't do something terrible. I explained to my partner that it was an emergency situation and that I couldn't refuse to help her. What I didn't realize at the time was that it was a setup. My professor just wanted to duck me and couldn't think of any better way to do it than to feign suicidal thoughts and claim an emergency when the only emergency was that she was horny for me.